Organic chemistry stands compounds of carbon linked with hydrogen, and molecules that are made only of carbon and hydrogen are called hydrocarbons. Most molecules that make up living things are hydrocarbons with other pieces, other molecules attached to them or working together with them. All of organic chemistry is therefore hydrocarbons, molecules of carbon and hydrogen, connected covalently to nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, and phosphorus. Let's take a look first at just plain hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are compounds that are made up of only carbon and hydrogen atoms. These atoms are connected to each other by covalent bonds. As we studied in the previous chapter, covalent bonds between hydrogen and carbon are non-polar because carbon and hydrogen have similar electronegativity or similar pull for electrons. So the electrons that are shared, as in a covalent bond, between hydrogen and carbon are shared about evenly. So those shared pairs of electrons spend about the same amount of time in between the nuclei of both carbon and hydrogen. Hydrogen can form only one covalent bond, max. And the reason for this is because it only has one electron total, so it can only share that one electron and therefore participate in one covalent bond. Remember, each covalent bond is made up of a pair of electrons. And if you can only contribute one electron, that means you can be a partner in only one pair. So it's important that you remember and that it makes sense why hydrogens can only participate in one covalent bond at a time. However, let's think of carbon. How many valence electrons does carbon have? Maybe some of you answered this. Carbon has 4 valence electrons. So in its outermost shell or valence electron shell, carbon has 4 electrons, and therefore, in order to complete its valence shell, it needs 4 more electrons. And the way that carbon does this most of the time, practically all the time, is to share its 4 electrons and therefore receive 4 electrons from different atoms that are also sharing. So carbon participates in 4 covalent bonds in order to satisfy its valence shell and become really stable. The simplest of all organic molecules is called methane. You don't need to remember the name, but here it is on the example as carbon that is sharing its 4 electrons in the valence shell with 4 hydrogen atoms. And therefore, it is making 4 single covalent bonds. All of these 4 covalent bonds are non-polar because, again, carbon and hydrogen have about the same electronegativity, so all the electrons are shared evenly. And therefore, this small organic molecule doesn't have polarity. It doesn't have any partial charge anywhere. It's just nice and neutral, evenly distributed everywhere. As such, this simple organic molecule is hydrophobic. So if you had a drop of methane, which would be hard because it's generally a gas, right? You've heard of methane gas that cows fart out, and it's a bad thing for our atmosphere. Well, if you could there is a way to make it into a liquid, and let's just hypothetically say it's doable. If we were to put it into water, this molecule would just clump together, kind of like an oil drop in a cup of water. It would not become surrounded by water molecules that would form hydration shell. Like, it will not dissolve in water because it's hydrophobic, because it doesn't have polarity. Okay, so let's move on from the smallest hydrocarbon to a slightly bigger one. You can make a hydrocarbon that has 2 carbons surrounded by hydrogens. Notice that each of the carbons has 4 covalent bonds, and every hydrogen can only have 1 covalent bond. You can continue this pattern to make propane, which is 3 carbons long, surrounded by hydrogens. We call these all hydrocarbons because they only have hydrogen and carbons part of its structure. Some molecules that you might be familiar with that are hydrocarbons are, other than the ones I've already named, are like gasoline. Molecules in your gasoline are between 4 and 14 carbons long. So it's a hydrocarbon that is 4 to 12 carbons long, surrounded by hydrogens by covalent bonds. You see here that the line of carbons that are connected to one another by covalent bonds is called carbon skeleton. So the carbon skeleton could be of various lengths, from 1 carbon to many, many carbons. The carbon skeleton can also be branched. So instead of all carbons being aligned just next to each other, they can be connected in a branched way, as is shown here by butane and isobutane. Of course, the more carbons that there are in a carbon skeleton, the more ways that you can branch it out. And when you get to the point of very large hydrocarbons, there are hundreds or thousands of ways that you could connect things together. Notice that both butane and isobutane have 4 carbons and 10 hydrogens. But they are connected differently, and therefore they have a different shape. And again, everything's presented flat here, but in reality, each of these atoms is a tiny sphere, and the way that they share electrons makes the spheres overlap with each other. So it's a 3-dimensional shape that will differ from butane to isobutane. And as you probably guessed, butane and isobutane have significantly different properties. So the way that the atoms are connected to one another will determine the 3-dimensional shape of the molecule, which will determine its function. Molecules that have the same number of all kinds of atoms, in this case, they both have 4 carbons and 10 hydrogens and nothing else. So same formula, it would be C subscript 4, H subscript 10. But the atoms are actually connected to one another via covalent bonds in a different arrangement. These 2 varieties of C4H10 are called isomers. So it's like 2 versions of the same amounts of atoms that are connected differently are called isomers. In addition to being of various lengths and branched or unbranched, hydrocarbons can also have double bonds between the carbons. And this significantly changes the structure and therefore function of these molecules. Note that hydrogens cannot participate in a double bond, because in order to participate in that, you need to donate 2 electrons to the sharing. And hydrogens only have 1 electron in its valence shell and 1 electron total, so it cannot participate in a double bond. So the only double bonding in hydrocarbons can occur between 2 carbons. So if we think of having only carbons and only hydrogens, but you can have them in a straight line, you can branch them, you can have double bonds, you can imagine the huge variety of molecules that can be made only with carbon and hydrogen. And all of this is because carbon has those 4 valence electrons and requires 4 more to complete its valence. That gives this variety. And all living organisms are based on this carbon chemistry, this variety. In fact, that's why carbon-based chemistry was originally named organic chemistry, is because it looked as though these kinds of molecules can only be taken, can only originate from living organisms. If you were to take organic chemistry and start writing down and drawing out these long hydrocarbons, you may realize that it's quite tiring to draw all the little lines that represent covalent bonds and all the H's that are made of 3 lines. It takes a long time. So there are several shortcuts that chemists have come up with to represent organic molecules. And here is an example of a branched hydrocarbon. It is written in a full form, then in a condensed form, and then it's drawn via a skeletal structure. This is really cool and really fun to draw. Each beginning of a line is representing a carbon, and where it makes an angle, that's the beginning of the next line, it represents another carbon. The line in between represents covalent bond. Notice that hydrogens are completely unrepresented in these diagrams, and this is because in case of organic chemistry, it is assumed that if nothing else is drawn in its place, then there are the maximum amount of hydrogens that can fit. So I recommend that you pause this video for just a moment and look through the example here to make sure that it makes sense, because skeletal formulas are going to be used in the future, and I don't want you to feel overwhelmed or anxious when you see that. To add even more variety to hydrocarbons, they can also form rings of various sizes, from 3 carbons on to larger ones. Carbons connected into rings can also have double bonds between them. So here are cyclohexane and benzene represented as a 6-carbon example. Of course, as you may predict, these 2 molecules have very different functions. And notice on the very right-hand side is the skeletal structure of the benzene molecule. Each corner is representing a carbon. So there are 6 carbons, and we just assume that there are the maximum number of hydrogens that can fit with each carbon. So if a carbon is participating in a double bond on one side and a single bond on the other side with its neighboring carbons, then it will only have 1 hydrogen sticking out, because carbon can form only 4 covalent bonds. One more example of names, molecular formulas, and structural formulas, including the skeletal structures, just to make you familiar with this kind of representation of organic compounds. You do not need to memorize the names of these. So hydrocarbons can be of various lengths. They can be branched or unbranched. There can be various double bonds between carbons. There could be ring or rings sticking out in different parts. You can create immensely varied and complex hydrocarbons. But to add even more variety, in living organisms, hydrocarbons also have additional chemical groups, also called functional groups. Here I will show you a few of the most common chemical groups or functional groups that are found in living things connected to hydrocarbons. You do need to know the structure and the name of each one of these functional groups. So when there is an oxygen and hydrogen, both covalently bonded to each other, that pair is covalently bonded to a hydrocarbon, that OH is called a hydroxyl group. Of course, only the oxygen can be connected because hydrogen, again, can only participate in one covalent bond, and when it's already connected to oxygen, it can't also be connected to a carbon. So you have a little O with an H sticking off of a hydrocarbon, then it makes a hydrocarbon into an alcohol. So the difference between ethane, a molecule with two carbons surrounded by hydrogens, and ethanol, which is the alcohol that people drink recreationally, is having this hydroxyl group attached. Remember, we talked about the fact that all hydrocarbons are non-polar and therefore do not mix well with water. They're hydrophobic. If you have a small hydrocarbon with a hydroxyl group, how do you think that changes its ability to dissolve in water? So think of that oxygen there, and oxygen is very, very electronegative. It's pulling electrons toward itself. In fact, it's pulling the shared electrons from the hydrogen toward itself and the shared electrons from the carbon on the other side toward itself. So it now has more electrons spending time around itself, making there be a slight partial negative next to the oxygen and a slight partial positive in the other parts of the molecule. This makes a alcohol, which are molecules with the hydroxyl group, hydrophilic. So they can be dissolved in water because remember how water molecules form those hydration shells around things? Well, it can do that around a hydrocarbon that has a hydroxyl on it to some extent, and therefore ethanol, like the stuff in vodka or tequila, it easily dissolves in water. The next functional group is called a carbonyl group, and that's when one of the carbons in the hydrocarbon is double bonded covalently to an oxygen atom. What do you think? How does having this oxygen affect the ability of the hydrocarbon to dissolve in water? Yes, having any oxygens on a hydrocarbon will increase the solubility in water. Okay, so no oxygen on a hydrocarbon, the hydrocarbon is not able to dissolve in water. It's completely hydrophobic. Adding one oxygen to a hydrocarbon will make it less hydrophobic and more likely to dissolve in water. How likely will depend on the length of the hydrocarbon that doesn't have oxygens. Okay, so if it's a short hydrocarbon with an oxygen, like the example here, ethanol, it will totally dissolve in water. Same if you add a carbonyl group to a short hydrocarbon, it will be able to dissolve in water. If it's a hydrocarbon that has several oxygens covalently attached, then it will increase even further the ability of that substance to dissolve in water. So next here is a carboxyl group. It's really important that you do not confuse these second and third one. The carboxyl group is when a carbon atom is both covalently bonded to an OH group and double bonded to an oxygen. That together, all of those three parts, the C, OH, and double bond to O, the whole thing together is called a carboxyl group. Okay. So if you see that, do not say it's a carbonyl and a hydroxyl. That will be wrong. The correct answer is it's a carboxyl group because it acts differently than the other two. And of course, it also increases solubility of hydrocarbons in water. Anytime you have an oxygen on a hydrocarbon, you will make that hydrocarbon more hydrophilic. Next is an amino group. Amino with an N, it's when there's a nitrogen that's covalently bonded to two hydrogens. You take that little chunk and stick it on a hydrocarbon, and you once again will increase how water soluble the hydrocarbon is because nitrogen is also an electronegative atom. The next functional group is sulfhydryl group. Pretty self-explanatory. It's the only one that has a sulfur. It's a sulfur and a hydrogen covalently bonded. When you stick that pair onto a hydrocarbon, you will not increase the ability to dissolve in water. However, you do provide some additional properties. And I say you as if you're doing this on purpose with little tweezers sticking stuff to molecules. This all is just part of nature and it happens on its own, part of chemical properties. But I'm just anthropomorphizing these molecules a little bit to be able to discuss them easier. Okay, so sulfhydryl group is sulfur hydrogen covalently bonded that are often found on hydrocarbons. Phosphate group is quite large in comparison to the others. It's a phosphorus with 4 oxygens covalently bonded to it. Not only that, but 2 of the oxygens also carry negative charges. So they're actually extra electrons. And it is an ion group that is being connected to a hydrocarbon. A phosphate group hugely increases the water solubility of a hydrocarbon if you find this group attached to a hydrocarbon, because there are 4 oxygens and 2 of them have negative charges. It's a really important functional group, and we will talk more about it in a future chapter when we talk about DNA and other nucleic acids. And last is kind of a non-glamorous functional group. It is simply a hydrocarbon group that sometimes sticks off of a hydrocarbon. It's carbon with 3 hydrogens covalently bonded to it. With its last possible covalent bond, that carbon is connected to a different carbon in a hydrocarbon. This, as you would expect, does not add to ability to dissolve in water because methyl group, like the sulfhydryl group, is hydrophobic because it's non-polar. And this group doesn't so much change properties of hydrocarbons, but it's very commonly found as little tags on larger organic molecules and has a significant weight in its meaning for the chemical language of cells. The 2 examples here are drawn using that skeletal formula or those skeletal structures. Again, pause and remember what each corner or beginning and end of each line means. Both of the molecules are structurally very similar. Notice that each one of those hexagons is present in the same way. They're connected in the same way. So that hydrocarbon skeleton, so just the part that just has the carbon and the hydrogens, is the same. However, the functional groups that are present here are different or connected in a different place. And of course, that makes these molecules functionally different because they have a different shape. However, having one or the other does make a huge difference, and it is those functional groups that make it so. Now that you know about the basic structure of organic molecules, hydrocarbons with functional groups attached by covalent bonds in various places, we can talk a little bit more about biochemistry and the macromolecules that make up our cells and that do most of the jobs in our cells. So macromolecules are large organic molecules. Most macromolecules are polymers, and what that means, poly is many. It is that there are many small molecules that are the same or very similar attached to one another in a chain. A monomer is like a generic word for each one of those parts. So as an example, if you think of a pearl necklace, we can say that the pearl necklace is a polymer and each one of the pearls is a monomer. Or another example would be a train that is made up of the engine and a bunch of different train cars. So even if the train cars are not identical, each one of them would be called a monomer, while the whole thing as it's connected together is called a polymer. So the words monomer and polymer are very, very general. What the actual monomer looks like in these macromolecules important to life, you're going to see in just a minute. There are 4 classes of macromolecules that make up living organisms, and we differentiate between those groups based on their structure. So they are carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. They are all more or less polymers, but the monomers that they're made up of are different. Biological monomers have a couple of things in common, and one of them is that no matter what the middle part of the molecule is made up of, there are usually a hydrogen and a hydroxyl group covalently attached to both sides of these monomers. So we will look at the different kinds of molecules that we would call a monomer, but one thing here in general is that it's a bunch of atoms clumped together, but on one side there is an OH group, hydroxyl group, and on the other side is just an H sticking out from some other atom that it's covalently bonded to. Okay? And when 2 of those same monomers, 2 molecules that are very similar in structure, come together and bounce into each other, they can link together by a covalent bond, and this process is called a dehydration reaction. The reason why it's called dehydration is because when they bounce into each other and hit in just the right orientation with just enough force, then the OH from one monomer and an H from the other monomer will link together to create a molecule of water, while the remaining parts of the 2 monomers will link via a covalent bond. So the linking reaction between different monomers in our cells is called a dehydration reaction because during the process, water leaves. Monomers connect with each other via dehydration reaction or dehydration synthesis to create polymers. That's the process of linking those pearls into a necklace, so to speak. If If you want to do the opposite and break up the polymer into its individual pieces like we do when we digest food that's a polymer, is to add water in. A molecule of water bumps into that covalent bond that was holding two monomers together. H from the water will connect to one of the monomers. OH from the water will connect to the other of the future monomers, and you separate them. And that process is called hydrolysis. Hydro means water, and lysis means to break apart. So hydrolysis is to break with water. So polymers are separated into their individual monomers by a reaction called hydrolysis.